everyone, to a special episode here at NotInHallOfFame.com. And I'm Kirk Buchner. I run NotInHallOfFame.com, along with the fictitious Athlete Hall of Fame, the fictitious Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and of course, the United States Athletic Hall of Fame. Hey, have you voted yet? Do that now or after you watch this great interview that I'm about to do. www.notinhalloffame.com/USA. And you can help decide who's going to be the first class in the United States Athletic Hall of Fame. Because nobody came up with it, so Evan Nolan and I did. There you go. Trademarks in action. You gotta love it. With me today, I've got Cooperstown Dave. Now, if you're thinking, I guess this guy's a baseball fan, and he's a fan of the Baseball Hall of Fame, you'd be right. Dave, welcome on the platform.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kirk.
Yeah, no, it's this was actually recommended by, I guess, a mutual acquaintance of ours, Vinny Lospinuso. I always give him props where is or where needed. And Vinny, as you know, and as myself is, we are huge Hall of Fame aficionados. With your handle, obviously, your expertise lies in the Baseball Hall, and I love hearing different takes. You sent me a few that you wanted to talk about, and I'm really excited about that because when I'm looking at some of the things that you are sort of looking at, you are all over the place chronologically. And I find that really interesting. I had the pleasure of speaking with one gentleman who is pushing for Jim McCormick to be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he does this phenomenal job. And it's interesting, obviously, with Jim McCormick being a player that nobody alive has ever seen. We're going to start off with somebody who you're a fan of a similar era, or maybe a little bit before that, Charlie Bennett.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that McCormick account. He does great work with that. Bennett is a similar era.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons he's not in is not only is there no one alive now that saw him play, but by the time the Hall of Fame was really up and running in a meaningful way, there probably wasn't really many people left or voting who would have known Charlie or seen him. So Charlie Bennett was a catcher. He caught for a few teams, but primarily the Detroit Wolverines, which was a franchise that no longer exists. It didn't turn into some other team. And then towards the end of his career, he was with the Boston Beaneaters, which is part of the Atlanta Braves franchise. So his peak was with the Wolverines. So that's another reason why this person wasn't in. There isn't really an existing franchise that would particularly honor his accomplishments. But Bennett's Hall of Fame case is kind of simple. So I would say he's the greatest catcher of the 19th century. So one part of that is we see this when it comes to discussing how do you compare Yadier Molina to Joe Mauer or something like that, where you have one person who was a catcher basically their entire career and another who wasn't really, for about half their career, but then they can stay in the game by batting. And then you get confused, like, is it fair to compare Molina's bat to Mauer's bat? Because it's really a different ask if you're catching or not. So the quote catchers that are in the Hall of Fame from the 19th century are people who played catcher not even 50% of their career. And so when I look at certain stats, I'll just choose 50% as like, did you play that position more than half your career? Charlie played it for 90%. And in the 19th century, it was a really demanding position. There was little to no equipment. And it was, they maybe weren't throwing 90 miles an hour, but you're going to mess up your hands and fingers catching bare hand all the time. And not only is that taxing, but then imagine with your battered hands holding a bat and being able to really swing it well. But Charlie, he has the most WAR among catchers in the first 35 or so years of baseball. He's third all time in fielding runs, which is the fielding component of Baseball Reference's WAR. So he's behind Pudge Rodriguez and Yachty for the most fielding runs as a catcher all time, which means he was the leader until whenever Pudge surpassed him. But on top of that, his OPS plus, which is OPS adjusted for era and ballpark factors, is 119. A 119 OPS plus for a catcher, especially one who is a decent fielder, let alone an excellent one, is really, really good. So another part of the reason why he's not in the Hall of Fame, and then I'll just sort of pause, is he doesn't have huge counting stats. that's again because shorter seasons back then, but also you're a catcher. You're not playing as much. He played almost exclusively catcher, and his hands were probably battered because he was that important to the team. They kept him a catcher. He was famous for being able to throw out base runners. In the 1887 World Series, his Wolverines played a St. Louis team that still has the record for most stolen bases in a season. They stole a billion bases. Yet when they got to the World Series, they got shut down, relatively speaking, in part because of Charlie. The news reports are like Charlie held them from advancing. And back then, you didn't have a lot of home runs. So this team probably hit a lot of singles and walked and then would steal to get into running scoring position. But if they couldn't do that because of Charlie, it hurt them. And they couldn't, even though they were the best team in the league all year, Detroit beat them. So he only has just under 1,000 hits. So if you were voting in the Hall of Fame in the 40s or 50s or whatever, you didn't see him play. You're seeing 900 some hits. You're seeing a batting average that isn't 300, which at the time was like you kind of need that or hit a billion home runs. And so that's his case, why he's not in. And I like him.
That's right there is good enough reason for me. I do like what you brought up earlier. I do find that when you're dealing with players, I mean, I think that would hurt just in the modern era. Fred McGriff, barely associated with any team, and currently Gary Sheffield. Now, if you're closely associated with a team that doesn't exist in any capacity, it has no lineage, it's pretty hard to generate any kind of fandom, even among people who obviously would not have seen it, but if it's not associated with your team, like if it's not like a past Cardinal, for example, which
Yeah,
is
and
forever.
it's curious to try to figure out like why that happens psychologically. I think there's an impact to just the everyday fan. I remember Bill James writing an article um in a studied way demonstrating that yeah, if you play for just one team your whole career, like if you could wipe out every other variable, one player's played for one team, the other played for four or five, the second guy's going to struggle with Hall of Fame voting. So that hurts in general. Charlie did play for a few, and then the major one, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
And then the one that does, the Bean Eaters, it was a Boston team. We're talking about the then Milwaukee Braves, Atlanta Braves. I'm pointing as if Atlanta is really below my apartment and not south, but south means this apparently. So his impact for that franchise was in Boston, and he was beloved in Boston. There is some history about him in Detroit, and there's little places that honor him, but he's not a Tiger. Though the Tigers' first stadium, or not first stadium, maybe one of the first stadiums or fields was called Bennett Park in
Oh,
honor of him. He's the only player to have a major league park named after him. That's how beloved he was, excluding there, of course, were parks that have the names of Connie Mack was a player, people who were owners of teams, Clark Griffith. But just a player, Charlie Bennett's the only one to have a park named after him. And he threw out the first ceremonial pitch every season for the Tigers for like 25 years after his career ended, which ended, he was at the tail end of his career, but he tragically was on a train with his best friend and Hall of Fame pitcher John Clarkson. They get off the train. Charlie falls, and his legs get run over by the train. Um, so that ended his career. He was again at the end of it, but he was one of those guys who was such a leader, even if his numbers didn't back up maybe keeping him on a roster. He was apparently one of these people you keep on the team even in decline because he's important in some intangible ways. But yeah, he had that tragic end, and he was beloved in Detroit. But again, the Hall of Fame then started in the mid 30s and took a while to get its footing. And by the time, he wasn't Cy Young level excellent. So by the time you get to someone like Charlie, he's kind of forgotten.
okay. There's one player like Bennett was on my radar. One person you want to talk about really isn't very much, and I don't know that much about him. Bill Dineen.
Bill Dineen um, is an interesting case. This is gonna connect to this other topic that I've become the guy on, which is Rule B,
Mhm.
which I need to explain in order to explain Dineen and my interest in him. Rule B is a rule in the committee process of the Hall of Fame. As I imagine people who listen to your work know, there's two paths to the Hall of Fame. There's the Writers Association, which votes on recent players. Then there's the era committees or veterans committees, which vote in players, managers, executives, umpires. There's three rules. Rule C is if you're ineligible, you're not eligible. Rule A is just like you had to have played in the majors for 10 seasons. You had to manage for 10 seasons. You have to be X age or retired for these types of things. Rule B is a different element that just explains how you're supposed to evaluate people. I'm looking off screen because I want to read it verbatim. It talks about that although there's these categories like player, manager, umpire, you're not supposed to evaluate a person by just those strict categories. The categories is more just a way to help facilitate the process. So Rule B says those whose careers entailed involvement in multiple categories will be considered for their overall contribution to the game. So what that means is, and there's more to it that explains, again, the process, but once someone's on a ballot, you're supposed to evaluate them for their total baseball career, or at least work in those explicit categories. So if you were a person like Bill Dineen, who was a pitcher or a player and an umpire, you would look at both of those. And Bill Dineen was an excellent pitcher. Probably not a Hall of Famer. He was about a 40 WAR pitcher. He had an excellent World Series. I haven't looked over his stuff that recently, but he kind of seems like a Madison Bumgarner type, because everyone always likes a more modern comp. Madison Bumgarner's not a Hall of Famer. He's not that far off from being borderline. But Bill Dineen also was a very celebrated and very long tenured umpire. And when you look at the umpires in the Hall of Fame, if he never pitched, he'd fit right along in sort of the indicators as I see them for what makes a Hall of Fame umpire. But when you take that umpiring and the pitching, he's way easily over the line.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because sometimes you do get those where it's almost hard to classify because of the whole body of work. I see that a lot more in football, especially where you'll have that like a player like Bucko Kilroy, who could probably get in as a player, but his best path is as an executive, and we're conditioned not to sort of look at the whole thing, or at least they're telling us that that's how it's conditioned. What they do and what they don't, obviously, it's two different things. And as we know, the seniors category or the seniors committees are the very different perspectives than the writers, which isn't a bad thing. It's just sometimes how that is. You mentioned that there's a few Negro League players who you're really big on, and I'd like to. Oh, first off, I guess I want to know your take now, because now that's been combined with all. I guess with the next time they're going to be up will be the pre-1980, which we did see work in terms of getting Buck O'Neill elected, which was a travesty that he wasn't considered before. And maybe to your point, on the field, maybe he wasn't a Hall of Famer. His overall body of work and just keeping everything alive. Actually, the only Indians game I ever went to back when it was the Indians would have been like 20 years ago, and I think he was there throwing out the first pitch.
Yeah, and Buck O'Neill's a really interesting Hall of Famer in the process sense as well, because so a Bill Dineen, it could become an issue of when it comes to making a ballot. First, they have to identify a category where you were primary. For him, you'd probably say he was primarily an umpire. And then, so he'd be like sort of make a ballot as an umpire. If his career, let's say, had bridged, there's a 1980 time post currently with these committees, as you alluded to.
Right.
Now, if like his umpiring had been pre-1980, which it was 100 years ago, and then or the other way around, if his playing was pre-1980 and umpiring was after, he would then have to be fit into that post-1980 committee. And you could then add his playing in when you evaluate it. But Buck O'Neill kind of, it's almost like, what is he in for, in the sense of if you're so viewing in strict categories? And the fact that someone like him gets elected kind of shows that you're not supposed to think that way. And he's especially interesting because it's not that he just has a bunch of value in all or multiple categories. He's in, if you're in as part of a category, he's in as an executive. which I've heard people say like he'd probably laugh at because he probably had certain executive roles in his life, but he wasn't an executive. He wasn't an owner of a team or a GM or something like that, so much as a certain type of figure that I think I know Vinny and probably others would love to see get in.
Mhm.
But Felipe Alou is one I talk a lot about, where he has a lot of value in a lot of different areas. I'm not sure what you'd say his primary category is. Maybe pioneer, but even then, is it before or after 1980 where it mostly happened? I think you could argue either way, and it's a shame because of the way the process gets convoluted. Someone like him struggles to ever get on a ballot. Yet if he got on a ballot, I think then it's like, oh well, he should get in. He's done all these things. When it comes to Negro Leaguers, just a few people that I myself and I know a lot of others talk about. Vic Harris is somebody
Mhm.
who managed a lot of great teams. He was a great player. He's a I think he only fell a couple votes short or something like that recently in an era committee. So hopefully he gets in soon. John Beckwith was a incredible hitting third baseman. He's outside the hall. Heavy Johnson is somebody who just to throw out names, Dobie Moore. Those are some individuals that certainly deserve a look. And the Negro Leagues also has a lot of that sort of Rule B element, like Vic Harris. There are a lot of others who managed and played um, baseball.
Mhm. It's funny, even just the way some managed and played. I mean, like it's still to this day. Even though I did see a bit of that with Pete Rose, the whole concept of a player manager just blows my mind, even at age 50. You'd think I would have seen some more of that in other sports, and it just I can't wrap my head around it, even though I've seen examples of it in my life.
Yeah, and some of these were player managers. Some of them it was they managed after their playing days, or
Mhm.
both.
Yeah.
Um, but for reasons that have been discussed, there's a lot of review that needs to be done on who's missing from that era, since they were, of course, grossly overlooked for so long.
There's another player that you mentioned that you're pretty big on, who sort of get falls behind, but falls behind not because he wasn't sort of in a vagabond category where he went from team to team. Uh, if I remember correctly, he only played for Cleveland and Texas. Someone who, in terms of advanced stats, and I kind of want to go. That's sort of a great segue to ask your opinion on that. Like when you're looking at Baseball Reference, Fangraphs, because I'm assuming that you are. How much do you put into that? And obviously, the player we're talking about, or maybe not obvious to some people, it's Buddy Bell. Really, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, I think like a five-time All-Star third baseman, and in his peak, really, really good. But Cleveland and Texas were not. I don't even know how
Right.
many winning seasons he even had.
Yeah. I certainly look at more traditional and more advanced stats, both. Um, in general, when looking at Hall of Fame, I'm usually not that big of a leaning on postseason,
Mm-hmm.
because Buddy Bell's an example of why. Perhaps the biggest reason Buddy Bell isn't in the Hall of Fame, Buddy Bell has the fourth most games played without ever playing in a postseason.
Also, none.
So,
Okay. Oh,
so
so,
Ernie Banks famously is the top. Of course, when Ernie Banks played, there was part of it at least. There was just a World Series. There's not a championship series.
mhm.
So there's obviously fewer games and fewer teams that can make the playoffs. Buddy Bell played later, but yeah, he didn't play for great teams. Should that be held against him? I don't think so. It gets held against you no matter what, just in the minds of fans, because you don't hear the name as much in those big moments of October. But yeah, he's fourth behind Banks, Luke Appling, and Mickey Vernon. But Bell, yeah, he's a 5 times All-Star. He's a 66 WAR player, and he just seems overlooked. And I think it's because of that. Among third basemen, there's only four that have 2,000 hits and 150 fielding runs, which again is the fielding component of WAR. It's Brooks Robinson, Adrian Beltre, Scott Rowland, and Buddy Bell. So to me, when I look at stuff like that, it shows an ability to hit. 2,000 hits certainly tells me they hit for a long time. 2,000 people still kind of look down on, but I think people need to be thoughtful on positions. when you get to 2,000 hits and you play like your whole career at catcher, third base, center field, it's way more than getting 2,000 hits at first base.
For
I
sure.
mean, there's a reason why third basemen don't do that. It's physically demanding and difficult. So those are three pretty impressive names to be next to for Buddy Bell. And to think maybe if he was just on better teams, he'd be in. I'm not that into holding that against the guy.
I joked with Vinny once, I think it was Vinny I said this to, that I could build a dynasty out of one and done Hall of Fame players. Bell at third, Lou Whitaker at second. Just look, Whitaker obviously comes to mind.
Willie Davis never even made a ballot.
Yes, which is the craziest thing ever. That he never, because I think his WAR is over 60, is it not? Close
It might
to,
be
yeah,
like 55 or something. But
yeah.
and then of course there's the guys who were one and done for just because of PED backlog reasons, like Edmonds and Lofton, who maybe they would have been able to stick around longer. So that's one of my other sort of passions is like I think there's some underrating of center fielders because we mentioned Willie Davis, Edmonds, and Lofton. Um, my quick theory there is that Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays kind of ruined it for everybody. They
Something to
skewed
that.
everyone's expectations of what to expect from the bat of a center fielder. And so Mantle debuted in 52, I think. No player who played at least half their career in center field got to the Hall of Fame until Puckett and Griffey Jr. So I don't know offhand the year that Puckett debuted, but there's a lot of years where no one debuted, played most of their career at center field, and got in the Hall of Fame.
I've often said, and because I just on another show that I do that they'll go up eventually. I've got like 8 shows I've recorded over the summer. Sorry about the awkward jump cut. As you might have heard at the end of that, there was an alarm in the building. And when that sort of happens here in Mount Manitoba, well, it doesn't really go off until God knows when. So it's not that we magically change clothes. We're just Cooperstown Dave and I were both hygienic. We just didn't want to wear the same thing because we're doing this 24 hours later for part 2. Where we left off, I was going to ask your opinion. We didn't really sort of plan this, but this is one of my favorite players, and I'm wondering what your take is on Kenny Lofton in terms of the baseball hall. Somebody who I think probably because he played for me, I think 11 teams, although half of his career was with Cleveland, where I think he supplanted or took over the mantle as the best leadoff hitter in baseball from Rickey Henderson. Another one and done guy, because we were talking about that I could build a dynasty with one and dones.
Absolutely. So for one thing, his one and done was probably in part due to the backlog of just all these PED guys, as people call them, just stuffing the ballot and making it hard for someone like him or Jim Edmonds to get on. And really, like, as we've seen with Scott Rowland, and I think we'll see maybe with some others, it's really important to just stay on because then you can get momentum.
Right.
But with Lofton, again, like I sort of referenced yesterday, Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, I think, kind of have thrown expectations of what people expect from a center fielder when it comes to tremendous power and playing center field forever. So, yeah, I'm a big Kenny Lofton guy. I do think that probably playing on all the different teams doesn't help him, which is, of course, interesting because you think in a way, then wouldn't a bunch of different fan bases like you in a close way? But for whatever reason, it seems like that consolidation of people like to associate one person with one set of laundry for 20 years. But Lofton's case, and we're going to talk about Chase Utley in a bit, they're similar in so much as they're toolsy guys. Toolsy guys like that, unless they hit the big benchmark milestone numbers, often can struggle, especially when big value in your tools are not just coming from hitting. So fielding and base running tend to be areas of the game where an offensive player doesn't get as much credit, of course. And to an extent, it's reasonable, but it's unfortunate. But Kenny Lofton, using the base running, fielding, and batting values that constitute Baseball Reference's WAR, he has 100 batting runs, 100 fielding runs, and 100 baser RDP, which is like the base running and double play avoidance. He has 100 of each of those three. He's the only player in baseball history that has 100 in each of those values. So 100 in batting runs isn't that high. That's not going to get you in. But that just is one way to demonstrate the completeness. He also is one of a small list of players with 2,000 hits, 500 stolen bases, and 100 home runs. That 100 home runs may seem insignificant, but that allows you to kind of weed out some 19th century guys who may have those stolen bases. It was a different time. And most of those guys on that list are Hall of Famers, except Ichiro, Bonds, and then, interestingly, Cesar Cedeno and Jose Reyes. But these are guys who, some of them get injured, some of them have character clause issues, but Lofton doesn't exactly have those. And I just think it's a situation where if he gets on a committee ballot, we might get to see some traction.
Okay. One thing actually I forgot to mention when we sort of got abruptly cut off yesterday that I wanted to go into. I'm wondering if your opinion on this is parallel to mine or maybe different. The PED guys, and specifically for me, I have a delineation line. And that's the 2004 with the Mitchell report. And when basically everyone had agreed, the union agreed, okay, our guys cannot take performance enhancing drugs. So personally, I don't give a crap what Bonds did, Clemens did, or anyone did before 2004. Because if Major League Baseball were allowing him to do it, which they were, then I don't care. Also, they put in the guy who oversaw everything. And I know that a lot of people, with that being Bud Selig, and I'm sure you saw what I saw, that a lot of writers said, well, then if they're going to put him in, then that's going to change my vote. And we did see an uptake at that point in the next ballot for the writers, because they did jump up significantly. So I personally would put Bonds in. I think it's criminal that he's not. I do however, have an issue with A-Rod.
And Manny, I guess.
Manny Ramirez too, although I rank them very highly on the not in Hall of Fame list. I completely can't defend anyone who says they cheated, because they did knowingly.
Right. So I agree to some extent. For one thing, we know it's been admitted there are many players who abused greenies and amphetamines, which were, because some people on this issue, they talk about, well, these drugs are illegal. Well, that was illegal. It was also, I mean, I don't know how the rules were written then, but if you're worried about competitive advantage, that's serious. I don't know you or anybody who may be listening, if they've ever, for prescription reasons or otherwise, tried something that isn't amphetamine. But these are very powerful drugs. These players aren't using them for no reason. And people just tend to give a pass because I think they like those golden days when things were great and America was something. It's a very cultural thing. But for me, my, I guess, pushback to your view would simply be, are we going to double penalize people? A-Rod, Manny, they were suspended. Should they also be held out? Maybe, the Hall of Fame is a separate institution. I'd put them in because, and I know, like, I have a buddy, we talk about this, and Sosa is one where he's not as into because he thinks the drugs are the only reason he was good enough. But I don't know how we're supposed to determine that. And I just don't like even playing into the game and thought. We all become biochemists, and people are delineating between different drugs and different chemicals, and it's like, what are we even doing?
That's fair point.
But it's all subjective. Anybody can have their view, but I put in these people.
Okay. Sosa, I think, though, personally, I think what's also holding him back is it's always, and I've always said this on every hall, it's people voting on people. And for you and I've never met any of these players. I've talked to quite a few football players who are coming up there, but in baseball, I've never met any of them. We know from what we've heard that there's a lot of people who are not great people. And I think with Sosa, who played to the media a lot, and then it changed very, very quickly. It became confrontational. A lot of it had to do with, I think, was it Rick Riley? I think who, in a Sports Illustrated article, I might have this wrong. I'm just going off the top of my head, who was talking to him, well, okay, then let's do a test now. Because he always said that he didn't do that. And then just, there was another article where just like cracks and everything. And then the whole Sosa mystique, because a lot of us bought into that whole home run chase. And it was McGuire's chase. Sosa was just there behind. But Sosa was, how can you not love this guy? He just seems like a great guy. And then you find out maybe he's not. And I wonder if sometimes a writer just feels, I got played by this guy. I'm not voting for him. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there because his lack of love compared to some of the others, I get it, but it seems awfully a lot lower than it should be, the numbers. That's my take.
I guess it's partly like McGuire set, or at the time at least, I think, did Pete Alonso break it, like the rookie home run record? So the idea is, on one hand, it's like, oh, he always mashed. But for one thing, Sosa in his early part of his career was a really great defensive player. He was better than I think people remember and realize. Mm-hmm. But I also just take umbrage with the whole situation because it seems like so much of it ends up being focused entirely around one particular baseball action that people love most, and that's the home run. Mm-hmm. You've got people, I mean, I want to say things without trying to name names and accuse people who've never been accused of stuff, but like, let's say you're a great stolen base person, or you have a different set of skills, mm-hmm. and you use these things, and it helps you do better at that. That doesn't seem to matter to people because the home run and Roger Maris and Hank Aaron, mm-hmm. it's an emotional thing, and that's silly to me. So there's also the fact that there's people who I guarantee took whatever drug you want to think about, and for whatever reason, maybe it only made them a little better, maybe it did nothing in terms of statistical improvement, or maybe it allowed them to stay at the level they were at when they otherwise would have gone down. Mm-hmm. So like, it's just a very complex thing. I'm not particularly interested in trying to litigate the details of that because I don't know. You get in these conversations in social media, or you see them. It's like, what are we even doing? Who are you? What's your science background? Obviously, I understand these things definitely help these players that mm-hmm. people talk about most, but
I think you hit on something though, Dave, because
I think so too. I like my opinions as well.
Yeah, because when it comes to baseball, like you said, I mean, it's a great historical passion. It's this beautiful game that we romanticize. And when we look at the numbers, that's what we romanticize also. I don't know if you watch football. I'm sure not as much. Okay, so I'm going to use an example then. A guy named Von Miller, who plays for Buffalo now. He's going to be a Hall of Famer, and he got from everything he did in Denver, and he should be. He's probably going to be a first to second or third ballot Hall of Famer. He got popped for a 6-game suspension. I guarantee you in that room, nobody's going to care. I've never seen an article about that. Well, he cheated.
Right.
So that will not even be discussed in that room among fans, among media. And that's somebody who's going to go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And that's not going to be a blemish about him. It's like, what's the difference? Why do fans not care? And my theory is kind of tying in with what you said. Football is romanticized in terms of numbers.
Yeah, and then, I mean, there have been many, many players who have said, I know that there are this many people in the Hall of Fame who definitely use these particular drugs. And I say that last part in that vague way because I think that's important. People just say steroids. I had a surgery on my arm. I have a little wound. You know what I have to put on it right now? A steroid cream. Like, there's a lot of different things for all these different words. Performance-enhancing drugs is a big net of a term. It becomes just such a ham-handed discussion of just throwing everything at the wall, and there's bound to be people in already. It doesn't mean, well, if one person commits a crime, we don't prosecute the other one. That sort of, like, two wrongs don't make a right. Mm-hmm. But it's just baseball. I'm very passionate about baseball. My Twitter account's consumed with numbers, so I love the numbers too. But let's get off our high horse a little bit. And I had a great time in 1998 in those years watching those guys hit.
I did too.
And if our ancestors' favorite childhood players get to be in the Hall of Fame, I don't like whitewashing the things I enjoyed. And I hope that there'll be, with the turnover of time, certain players, the dam will break and people will get in and we can just move on from this conversation.
So when we look at then character issues, I know, sorry, I'm just sort of like thinking about this here out loud as we talk. One thing I mentioned that I'm doing is self-promotion. It's the United States Athletic Hall of Fame. And part of our thing is we've got people there who can vote for, who may not necessarily be the best people in life. Ty Cobb being one of them, Roger Hornsby, but two of the best, period. That also goes into other sports here. We're looking on the ballot now. Probably the biggest drop I've ever seen in a modern candidate is Omar Vizquel.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I know where you're going, and this is a trickier.
I don't even know where I'm going, to be honest.
No, I know, and it's like I have a clearer view on the PED stuff than I do on the types of things you're talking about.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be that quick to vote for Vizquel regardless. But yes, I'm gonna be a bit inconsistent in when I say like, oh damn, forget the character clause when it comes to most things, but I gotta tell you, when it comes to certain things people do or have done or could do, I'd be hard pressed to want to vote for them, even though the actions are unrelated to the game, because they're deplorable things. That's one reason I'm glad I don't actually have a vote. But I'm not trying to take Cap Anson out of the Hall of Fame or people who are already in, really, for any situation. Roberto Alomar is banned from baseball and he's in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that's an interesting one there too, especially as a Jays fan, right?
There's also people on the ballot right now who have been accused of things, and then charges were dropped or whatnot, that people don't really talk about those issues that they had, and they might get in the Hall of Fame, but I don't know. It's hard. It's a case by case basis. I wouldn't be eager to want to vote for Omar Vizquel given what he's been accused of, but my instinct is, and I don't love it, is just look at what they did on the field, and we can know, like, I don't like that person. They're a bad person. They did some horrible stuff.
I was against Vizquel before all this broke out. I was always impressed, for his longevity, and how can you not be? Saying that, as I looked back year by year, I kind of thought, we always talk about compilers in baseball. I found Vizquel to be a defensive compiler, an incredible player, but was he ever your top 3 guy in that position? Defensively, yes. Saying that, if you had Vizquel there, you're always, if you're GM, you're looking over your shoulder. Well, maybe I can sort of upgrade this, even in his peak. Okay, yeah, I've got him great. I've got somebody pretty good, but you're listening. Like maybe.
Yeah, I mean, he's a player who. It's not like I would totally dismiss his playing candidacy. It's just very low on my priority list of interest. I like a bit more bat, and the glove, at least using advanced analytics, it doesn't bear out as impressive as the Sports Center highlights I watched every morning growing up. I like to look at various types of data points. I like to see, like, what was like with Charlie Bennett, anecdotally in the newspapers and stuff, he was discussed as the best. When it comes to the limited traditional stats and limited advanced stats we have, they both support that. So when you see that full picture, then I can feel pretty confident. Vizquel, there's a little bit more doubt, and then the bat is just so relatively weak for what you look for in a Hall of Famer. And then you get into the conversation of, well, is it because like his, plus stats, his relative stats are suppressed because other people are using PEDs? Like, I just don't. He's not that most compelling, interesting case for me. And in a way, it's like, if nothing else, given what he's been accused of, I'm no thanks.
Well, let's talk about someone who you really want to make a big case for, and that's Chase Utley.
So I'm a Philly guy. When people talk about like who's the captain of the team, in a certain level, I think it's Utley. On the other, I think it's Rollins. But Chase Utley is, again, one of these guys who's a complete player. He didn't have the personality and sort of showmanship in a certain way that Ryan Howard was hitting 50 home runs. Jimmy Rollins loved the camera and is a great talker. Chase is kind of to himself. He'd get his uniform dirty, which Philly people love, but he was a great all-around player. It's hard to talk about his case without getting into some advanced statistics. However, to start with some traditionals, I mean, I don't have it on hand, but certainly has some great rate stats when it comes to power as a second baseman. But base running, he had 154 stolen bases. He has the highest stolen base percentage of any player in history with at least 100 attempts at a stolen base. He was an incredibly efficient base runner. It also bears out in the statistics we have that just sort of reflect on not just stolen bases with base running, but overall, like avoiding double plays. We look at, again, those components of WAR. He had the only players with 150 batting runs, 100 fielding runs, and 50 of those R base or R double play combined is him and Willie Mays. So he was a very complete player. He didn't hit like Robinson Cano at second base exactly, but he was really, really good at everything. Those types of guys often fall by the wayside. Advanced analytics, I think, are bringing them out more. But he is, I understand the weaknesses in his candidacy. I think it's also important to think about when people see relatively or seemingly low totals, it's hard to play at a high level at some of these positions for a long time. People want to see a lot of hits, but they're kind of thinking about how many hits a first baseman might get in their career. When you look at a catcher, a second baseman, or Scott Rowland, a lot of people were knocking Scott Rowland's longevity. He's in the top 10 or so of a lot of lists of most career fill in the blank as a third baseman. It's hard to do that for a long time. So I'm a big Chase Utley guy. Again, when you look at the components of WAR, I won't cite the specific numbers, but nobody matches his numbers. And you have to reduce each one of those numbers by so much to get to somebody who matches them. So you have to bring them down 19%, all of them by 19% to get someone who matches all of his WAR totals. And that's Kenny Lofton of all people. And then it's only him and Lofton until you get down to 45%, reduce them all by 45%. And then suddenly there's two other people who can match that. And it's Whitaker and Trammell. So these are guys who, again, a great set of skills in all the ways. They might not have been the greatest at any one, though really Chase Utley has a case for being one of the absolute best base runners of all time. He's just not Ricky Henderson stealing bases at such a tremendous, volume. I'll pause there.
No,
I could go on.
Yeah, I wanted us to conclude. I asked you if you could sort of like maybe predict, or you don't even have to necessarily predict, or who you would like to see as the six or the possible candidates for the next ballot, and not for the modern era, but we were talking about the non-players.
Right. So this would be called the 2024 non-players ballot. So it's managers, umpires, and executives, sort of / pioneers, where the majority of their contributions came after 1980. The sort of list that I would give for who I think will be on versus who I'd like, there'd definitely be some differences. But number one, most guaranteed person I expect to see is Lou Piniella. He fell one vote short of election the last time he was eligible by committee. He is 17th all time in managerial wins. He only won one pennant, though. It was a World Series with the Reds. And that was frankly very impressive when you think about it. He took over after the Pete Rose scandal. And you can only imagine what that must have been like culturally in that clubhouse and for that organization, especially if you're old enough to remember. I was rather young, but that was a massive story. And it's not like that Reds team was the most talented team to ever
God,
win.
No.
And they won. Right. And
that coming.
It's debatable, how and what do you give managers credit for? But in a way, all those factors I just described, I think a manager must have played a big piece. Now, he did have just the one pennant, though. There are no Hall of Fame managers that won fewer than 2 pennants. So he would set a new precedent there. However, you got to think about the fact that a lot of the managers in the Hall of Fame played in eras where there's only 8 teams in a league. So to win a pennant, you got to be better than 7 other teams. A lot of Pinella's career, it's, many more teams per league that you got to beat. So I think Piniella makes it. Second name I'd say, and I was bearish on the potential, but when you look at it, it seems kind of inarguable, is Jim Leland. He's never made a ballot. He has won 3 pennants. Other than Ralph Houck, who took over for Casey Stengel and led the Yankee teams, everybody who's won 3 pennants in, since 1900 in the AL and NL is in the Hall of Fame. And I say that last part because there's some Negro League managers who are not in, which is a shame, and hopefully they get in. So Piniella, Leland. Another name I'd say, not that I'd love to see.
Can I ask one thing on Leland? Do you think that the Baseball Hall of Fame or that committee will factor in anything that he did with Team USA in the World Baseball Classic?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I also wonder that when it comes prospectively with the World Baseball Classic in the future, but if they consider Team USA, I think that would boost. Mike Scioscia, I think, has done stuff with that team. Roland Hemond, who is an executive who I would love to see on this ballot, but to this point, I don't know if I've ever heard of that being a consideration for any candidate that's occurred.
Yeah, the only reason, because it's sort of been sticking in my mind too, I read an article that kind of rubbed me the wrong way some time ago, and basically the premise was that the Baseball Hall of Fame has a big issue regarding Asian players because there's none in the Hall of Fame, and the article did sort of acknowledge that Ichiro was going to get in, but they're more or less saying, why aren't you counting all the stuff in Japan or other things? And so my response was, because the first word in the Hall of Fame is national.
Yeah.
And, and it's not like it's not going to happen. There will.
And it's also, it wasn't until I'm blanking on his name. There was a Japanese player in Major League Baseball in the 60s, briefly. Otherwise, it wasn't until Hideo Nomo where there were at least Japanese players, and Japan is kind of the biggest hub of baseball activity in Asia. So there just hasn't been that much opportunity when it comes to in MLB. When it comes to incorporating the Japanese numbers, it'll be interesting to see. People talk a lot about the Hall of Fame, but I feel like they then don't even read the plaques. And it'll be interesting to see if, and I bet they will mention like anything about Ichiro's play in Japan, because it is the National Hall of Fame. But if they mention like total career hits as a professional and they're including Japan, that's interesting. When it comes to looking outside of America, though, there have been Jose Mendez and some others who their play outside the US is mentioned in the plaque and was certainly considered. But, we're talking about people who were omitted from playing in MLB for sort of racist type reasons. However, look, these Japanese players, based on they can't break the law, they haven't been allowed to come here. Ohtani came here kind of as quickly as he could, but there's rules in Japan with the NPB about when you can become eligible.
Well, I think also too, because then it made me look at the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame, and there's no American on it, and if it's not for basically for the United States bringing baseball there. There's nothing, maybe in the actual hall there is, but in terms of actual people, so I've never been to the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame. I'm just going by the actual members there. But that was just one thing where I'm thinking, like, it'd be one thing if they just said Baseball Hall of Fame, but if you're saying national, you're talking about leagues that are comprised in the United States. So that makes sense to me.
There's an unfortunately decent amount of people who quibble enough about the Negro Leagues being a part of this. I think there'd be a lot of frustration around, and I think it's not necessarily at least due to explicit racism from those people, as much as people are intellectually lazy and they see these shorter seasons for the Negro Leagues and they're like, I can't compute how many hits are a good amount of hits because I'm used to these benchmarks and I refuse to like actually work hard with my brain to understand context for these Negro League stats. But when it comes, I think there'd be a lot of pushback from people around the Japanese league being incorporated, or at least you would certainly need to play a certain number of years here before you consider it. Like, would we have career Japan players in? I don't know.
But then that's what makes me wonder. Okay, so if this is the national, then do you think, well, okay, Team USA, that is national, everything else isn't? I don't know. This is
There's also the fact that when it comes to the World Baseball Classic, Major League Baseball is like deeply, it seems to be more ingrained and deeply involved in that than they were in the Olympics. So they have more skin in the game. MLB and the Hall of Fame are technically separate institutions, but they're extremely, you know, connected. I mean, both MLB is the one who creates the ineligible list, and the Hall of Fame's just like, hey, if you're on that organization's list, you're not in. There's obviously other reasons they are or need to be connected, but I would suspect the WBC stuff, and then perhaps retroactively, the Olympics will become more part of this discussion. I'm less confident in the idea that play in the leagues in Japan would.
okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. There was just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, it's a evolving conversation, but so for this upcoming ballot, Pinella and Leland, I think, are pretty strong certainties. The next one I was going to say, who I'm not eager to get in because of, there's a couple people who could make this ballot who have quite some warts, and this would be George Steinbrenner. The reason I would say he is a strong potential on this is he's made several ballots before. He hasn't fared well on those ballots, but the reality is if you're electing owners, which they do, I mean, Steinbrenner was the owner of a team that had the best dynasty of the past several decades, the most lauded dynasty. He has a pop culture level of fame that's unparalleled in recent eras. And I would bet you find 100 random people in the country and you ask them, can you name an owner of a baseball team? He's going to get the most responses, and he's been dead for years. So fame matters no matter whether one wants it to or not. But he definitely has some issues with his candidacy, but I would say Steinbrenner might be a third person on this ballot.
I guarantee you also the only one you'll mention that's hosted Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that big on the fame word within the Hall of Fame, and also there's the fact of when you have a dynasty, does everybody get in? Do you put in the owner, the GM, the director of this, the manager, 4 players? Like, how many people get credit? But you would think if I'm a player and I'm voting on the committee, I would think, man, this guy spent. This guy therefore forces other owners to spend, which help me make a better living and helps all the boats rise. And so, but again, he's got issues. But Steinbrenner, a fourth who I'd like to see still be on, but it seems like he's just not going to get traction, is Davey Johnson. He's made several ballots, but his managerial career in a vacuum is maybe not Hall of Fame level. He's 33rd in wins all time as a manager. He only won the one pennant, which was a World Series though. But he didn't win anywhere near the number of games Pinella did. But he was a sort of progressive-minded manager. He was a big proponent of on-base percentage before a lot of people were. And if he's been on the ballot, but he has a strong Rule B component. He was a 28 WAR player. He made 4 All-Star games. He won 3 Gold Gloves. And similar to Utley's situation, Davey Johnson's OPS plus, if you look at it and you're thinking about people like Vlad Guerrero and these corner outfielders or first baseman, doesn't seem that high. I think it's about 110. But as a career-long second baseman, to maintain that level of OPS is extremely impressive. So he also just seems like a well-liked guy. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Davey Johnson. That's 4. I'll try to go fast. Bill White is a 5th person.
Yep.
Absolute Rule B type guy. I think he'd make this ballot, given he was the president of the National League. He was the first African-American league president and highest ranking minority person in any of the sports when he did that. Yeah, he was the first African-American broadcaster for a team. Not that broadcasting tends to explicitly be part of this. Very well-respected guy. He was also a really great player, like a 40 WAR almost kind of guy and an 8-time All-Star. So especially as the people and the world progresses and we think in a more diversity perspective, a lot of league presidents are in the Hall of Fame. Bill White is a career baseball person, and so I would say him. Again, umpires are part of this group. I would expect to see at least one of each category. The easy one to say is Joe West. Like Steinbrenner, but the details differ. He's got probably some detractors, and rightfully so. But there's only a couple of data points sort of you would look at with an umpire, and the top one is longevity. He has the record for the most games umpired. That's significant. He will eventually someday get in the Hall of Fame. They don't often rush to get the umpires in as soon as they're eligible. And again, he could have some detractors on the committee that creates this ballot. But if I'm just trying to make a guess, I would still say he probably gets on. But umpires are tricky. One name that I would say definitely would be on this ballot, by the way, and I wanted to start with this but forgot, would have been Brian Sabian, who won 3 World Series with the Giants as a general manager and was key to putting together that Yankees dynasty of the 90s. It's a little unclear if he's eligible because he took a job as an advisor with the Yankees this year. And I don't know if these sort of advisory roles disrupt your eligibility, because there's an age for the executives where if you're above, I think 75 or something, you could still own a team or be the GM and you're eligible, but he's below that. So if his current role, which is technically an executive type role, if it's counting in the sense of the Hall of Fame, then he's not eligible right now. But if he was, he would be on here. And no matter what, you're going to see a plaque for him someday. Otherwise, just to try to wrap it up, I did 6 names, 2 more. Maybe Bruce Fleming, another umpire, 3rd all time in games. So the only ones ahead of him are Joe West and Bill Clem. Bill Clem was in the first group of, and it's a group of 2 Hall of Fame umpires. Probably the most famous umpire of the first many decades, along with Tommy Connolly, and they both got in the 50s together. So Bruce Fleming would be another. Walt Jocketty, who a lot of people just remember from his Reds tenure, and I think they forget that, and those teams didn't really win. But, Walt Jocketty won a lot with the Cardinals. He won 4 Executive of the Year awards. The only other people to win that many are Branch Rickey, George Weiss, those are both Hall of Famers, him, and Billy Beane. And Billy Beane's not eligible yet and didn't win on the level of a Jocketty. He also founded the Arizona Rookie League and Dominican Summer League, and those types of achievements tend to make an impact.
I didn't know that.
Well, that's why I'm here. I would hope.
Absolutely.
So those were 8 that I named just to say them. It was Piniella, Leland, Steinbrenner, Davey Johnson, Bill White, Joe West, Walt Jocketty, Fleming. But if I had druthers, 2 people I would sub in and take 2 out would be Felipe Alou, which we talked about yesterday, and Roland Hemond, who he deserves a podcast of his own to talk about, but he was a 70-year-long baseball person, won a couple Executive of the Year awards, impacted many franchises, did a lot of work to further the benefits of non-on-field personnel, like scouts, and he did so many things. He's like a Forrest Gump, where it's just like you look through baseball history and he's there. He drafted Hank Aaron's first contract for the Braves. You would know this better than me, but the sort of coaching trees in football, where you look at wow, I'm blanking on the Niners guy.
Bill Walsh.
Bill Walsh, and there's the tree of coaches that came from him, and then the ones come from him. There's sort of a Roland Hemond tree, where he helped mentor and give the first job to Dave Dombrowski and Ken Williams. I'm blanking on all the names, but Doug Melvin and Dan Evans. So, and he also won the Hall of Fame's Buck O'Neill Award, which I don't have offhand. I forget what that's for, but it's basically like, this guy was a wonderful person. He has that sort of Buck O'Neill thing without the cause.
Right.
So I wouldn't be so shocked to see him get on, but I would still be shocked, and it would be great if he did.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm definitely, if you're up for it, I'd love to have you on some other future shows. We do a whole lot of other baseball things where we're looking at, well, I do a lot more with that in football, but I'm going to start doing that more next year where we're just doing our mock committee in baseball. And there are a couple other projects that I'm going to ask you to be a part of. Thank you so much for doing this. As always, wherever you are, wherever you may be, stay safe, everybody.